recording.
Awesome. Well, welcome this evening to everybody. Welcome to another edition of Ask the Doctor. We're super excited. Today we are going to be learning a lot about diabetes by the look of the slide in front of us. And apparently it's the world's biggest health problem. We're lucky tonight to have Dr. Bob Rakowski here with us. He teaches, trains, and lectures doctors all over the world, and we're super blessed to have him. So without any further ado, over to you, Dr. Bob.
All right. Thank you always, Carol, for the beautiful intro and monitoring the room so wonderfully. And by the way, if you have questions, type them in the chat and we'll get to them. Questions can be on any topic, but you're right. We're going to focus on the world's biggest and most expensive, and I would say the most preventable health problem that we have. So now look at this picture. This was from a New York Times story, and this was a woman who had just had her leg amputated, which is the most one of the most common challenges with long-term diabetes. And I'll show you some interesting studies and cases where we can prevent that and reverse that. And this time cover story was very, very interesting. And it goes back 18 different years, but it shows this girl who's 11 years old who's just been diagnosed with diabetes. Now, a little over 30 years ago when I was in school, they used to call it, juvenile onset diabetes, and that was an autoimmune circumstance. And by the way, we know more now about preventing that. Or they also had adult onset, but they had to change the label because so many kids were getting type 2 diabetes. And we need to change that because that is a road to disaster. So one of the things I'm known for is putting together some very comprehensive graphics. And if you're a nutrition nerd or a physiology nerd, you might enjoy this. If not, just look and see how integrated everything is in the body and what happens when you let your sugar get out of control. But when we ingest too many refined carbohydrates or even artificial sweeteners, artificial sweeteners definitely increase the risk of diabetes. We're going to increase our blood sugar. And as we do, the body responds with an increase in insulin secretion. Now, there's one thing we know about physiology, and that bodies ignore constant stimuli. So, I'm in a room where I can hear the hum of an air conditioner if I pay attention to it. But since it's there all the time, I'm really not very aware of it. And our body's the same way when it comes to communication molecules. So if we're constantly secreting insulin, what happens is the body begins to ignore the signal of insulin. That happens by a process called insulin receptor downregulation. That's known as insulin resistance. And then ultimately, if that goes on for a period of time, that can lead to diabetes, which, by the way, is a $327 billion a year problem, and that's US alone. So as insulin elevates and as insulin rises, insulin tells a signal to the body. It says, store fat, don't break down fat. Insulin is a storage hormone. And for my doctors, I would tell them that it actually binds to something called the peroxisome proliferated activated receptor. If you're not a doctor, you probably don't care about that, or maybe you do, but maybe not the technicalities of it, because that is a signal that our body actually has to burn stored fat. But when that's blocked, you don't store fat or you don't burn fat, you store the fat. That can lead to obesity. Obesity is a risk factor for early death. And in fact, it definitely accelerates biologic aging. Obesity is also a risk factor for heart attack. In fact, the combination of diabetes and obesity has 650% increased risk of heart attack, a 498% increased risk of stroke. That's what CVA is, cardiovascular accident. And diabetes and obesity also raise blood pressure. And if you're interested in the specific mechanism, insulin causes sodium to be reabsorbed from the distal tubules of the kidneys. That is going to increase the blood volume. Why do people eat so many refined carbohydrates? Well, some very interesting studies show that it actually increases feel-good brain chemistry like serotonin, and it also has pain relief chemistry by stimulating something called beta endorphin. But again, if we do too much of that, we actually get a down regulation of our brain receptors. That leads to increased carbohydrate hunger. That will again lead to increased obesity. So as you eat more carbohydrates, as you gain weight, there's some things that happen Weight gain is associated with an increased inflammatory process in the body. We used to think that fat just sat there, but it doesn't. There's a number of molecules within it that increase inflammation. And inflammation is associated with fatigue. And by the way, an inflamed brain is a depressed brain. So we have this triad of weight gain, depression, fatigue, weight gain, depression, fatigue, etc. When insulin is secreted, there's a downregulation of something called sex hormone binding globulin. That increases the amount of free estrogen in the body, and that's bad for both women and men. Estrogen increases something called thyroid hormone binding globulin. You have decreased thyroid action. That, of course, will lead to increased obesity. As your insulin starts to rise, if you're a female, it drives two ovarian enzymes, 17-20-lyase, 17-alpha hydroxylase. That actually increases androgens, male hormones in females, and it increases something called polycystic ovarian syndrome, which can ultimately lead to infertility. As glucose rises, it's very, very oxidizing and inflaming to the body. That creates the problem of again, increased heart attack and stroke. But there's also a pattern of lipids that happens: elevated total cholesterol, decreased HDL, increased LDL, increased triglycerides. That again increases the cardiovascular risk. And as this oxidation happens, that increases pain, and pain increases something called inflammatory nitric oxide. That leads to increased fatigue. And we see that this chart is profoundly integrated. So why do I go through all that? Well, we have a simple rule. And that is that friends don't let friends become diabetic, because it literally is damaging to all the cells and all the systems in your body. And some of the things that can happen: fatty liver, heart attack, stroke, neuropathy, high blood pressure, dementia, depression, retinopathy. In fact, it's the #1 cause of preventable blindness, obesity, inflammation, infertility, immune dysfunction, preeclampsia, gout, sexual dysfunction. And yeah, it even increases the risk of cancer. So I don't know how well the audio is going to go on this, but it's a short enough video. I want to play it. This was day 1 that I saw this patient. This was 2 weeks later, and I filmed her when she came into my office. So we'll see if you can get the sound on that.
2015, I'm showing some pictures here of Maureen's foot. You can see some pretty good progress then. And Maureen, if you want to just put down your foot there, we can see that we've made some phenomenal progress. But let's turn back the clock. What were you thinking on February 3rd when you took that picture?
I was thinking I was going to lose all my clothes.
Yeah, they actually wanted to take you about mid-foot, right?
They call it TMA, transmetatarsal amputation, which meant clear across the top part of the foot.
Okay, so.
And then they said you'll just get an orthotic and you'll move on with your life.
Well, what?
I don't think so.
What changed everything?
Well, it's talking to you and giving me hope that, you know, with some supplemental health and some really, really hard work on my blood sugars and my overall diet, could give me a different outcome.
So, for the record, we sent a video of another patient that was told she had already had both legs amputated and they wanted to take her hand. And she said, no, I'll die before we take her hand. And amazingly, we completely saved the entire hand. And that's so motivating, as this beautiful result will be. But you said that this has been life-changing. How so?
It's been life-changing because it's been very empowering to know that, you know, you work with doctors and you do your best, but really ultimately it's all in your own hands. How hard you work, how much effort, how much you're willing to do. I mean, I feel like I'm in recovery now. I'm in recovery in my health, and I'm never going to leave.
So, do you have advice for future patients?
I'll make you ask for your but, you know, sit down with, you know, doctors and other health practitioners, you know, that, you know, build a relationship and trust yourself. I saw so many doctors who let me down during the process that I started to speaking doctors, and I thought that I found something I can trust to like, you know, move on with it.
Do I have your permission to use this information with doctors, students, patients, and even Facebook?
Yeah.
Any conditions on it?
So Maureen said, you know what, I'm in recovery. I'm going to get my health back. I'm never going to lose it again. That was her foot day 1. 2 weeks later, 17 months later, never had surgery. And I often use this as a teaching point. When there's a problem in an organ system, we could talk about the pancreas, the liver, the heart, the lungs, even sections of the brain. But there are three distinct zones of cells. There's cells that are dead. Well, there's nothing we can do about that. There's cells that are fine. There's nothing we need to do about that. But in between are cells that are functional but not functioning. And you can see there were some cells that were dead. Well, we couldn't do anything about that. Those toes just basically fell off. She never had surgery. But look how much better the foot looks. And by the way, every cell of her body was that much better. So how big is this diabetic problem? The cost in America alone, $327 billion, that's with a B, $billion a year. More expensive of the cost, the World Health Organization says that it will cost the world 25 million life years every year. So that's people dying prematurely and very sadly being nearly dead when they die. Diabetes causes accelerated biologic aging, on the average about 15 years of aging. And it represents 14.3% of all sick care dollars, or $1 in $7. So just imagine what we could do with that extra money if we actually educated people and prevented diabetes. And yes, it's even more expensive than cancer. So the most expensive problem in the world. And here's part of the reason. They have medical studies that show that diabetics, this was a study that said they wanted intensive therapeutics with multiple medications. The sweet spot is 5 to 9 medications. So the medical standard of care, if you're diabetic, they're going to put you on a minimum of 5 drugs or a maximum of 9 drugs for the diabetes, because that was the number of drugs where they lived the longest. But keep in mind that over time, these drugs stop working. So here, this study shows about different commonly used diabetic medications at a 5-year failure rate of 15%, 21%, and even 34%. So what happens with diabetes? Well, the cells of the pancreas that make insulin, called the beta cells, they stop working as well. The liver also develops a level of insulin resistance, but really the whole body does. And then what happens is, since sugar is not getting into the cells, the liver tells the body to make more sugars. It actually makes it by converting amino acids. There are things called glucogenic amino acids. It converts those amino acids to sugar. So literally it breaks down lean tissue to increase sugar because your insulin is not working as well. I tell this story. I was giving a lecture at a local hospital, and I was talking to a hepatitis support group. And on that same night, there was a mix-up in meeting rooms. There was a diabetic support group. When I talked to the nurse practitioner, I asked her, I said, well, looks like we're sharing the room. How much time do you need? She says, well, I only need 5 minutes. How about you? And I said, well, I'd like 30 minutes to talk and 30 minutes for questions and answers. So her entire presentation was, here's drug A, these are the pros and cons. Here's drug B, these are the pros and cons. Here's drug C, D, and E, here are the pros and cons. Hopefully 5 years from now, we'll have newer and better medications. And we won't have to worry about this. Does anybody have any questions? And one guy in the front row said, yeah, I've been diabetic for 30 years. What exactly does insulin do in a healthy body? Well, amazingly, she wouldn't answer the question. So, her whole education for these people was, here are the drugs, and, hopefully we get newer and better drugs. So here's a fairly new publication and new data. 2019, they actually found out that when people have diabetes, they start getting fat everywhere, or insulin resistance. In some people, the muscle gets marbled with fat. Other people, the liver becomes fatty, the kidney becomes fatty, even the heart can become fatty. But when the pancreas becomes fatty, engrossed with fat, then the cells work less efficiently. So one of the things they learned years ago is, well, guess what? If they took diabetics and did a bypass surgery, cut their stomach from the size of a football to about the size of a tennis ball, well, then they could reverse diabetes fast. Well, my answer is, do you have to butcher the stomach to get that same effect? Couldn't we just cut back the calories? And data is that we absolutely can. So, what does insulin tell the body to do? It tells it to absorb not just glucose, but fatty acids and amino acids. So it's absolutely critical for health. And it also tells the body to stop breaking down. So it basically starts building up and stop breaking down. It's called anabolic and anti-catabolic. So this was a picture of a young lady just at the time of the discovery of insulin. She was a type 1 diabetic. It's probably about all they had around 1923. But notice that she was wasting away. She couldn't get amino acids into cells, sugar into cells, fatty acids into cells. And then after insulin, saved her life, no doubt about that. So that was a very good discovery. A professional football player, this was fairly well known, maybe about a decade ago, Jay Cutler, he developed type 1 diabetes at age 24, and he just started losing weight, 35 pounds in a very short period of time. Well, then they found out he had type 1 diabetes, and they had to fix that. We're going to talk mostly about the other end of the spectrum, that insulin is a storage hormone. It says store fat, don't break down fat. And in fact, this reference says it's impossible to store fat without the presence of insulin. And we see that a lot of the world is having challenges with excess body fat. So I give, talks on that. I can do one in the future. But insulin certainly is one of the major factors in the fat storing body. Diana Schwartzbein wrote a great book about the progression of diabetes. She said, look, when you start eating too many carbohydrates, the first thing that happens is that insulin rises, first after a meal, and then it just stays elevated. The second thing that rises is body fat. The third thing that elevates is blood fat, the ratio, elevated total cholesterol, decreased HDL, increased LDL, increased triglycerides. The last thing that rises is sugar. So here's a very important point. If people are only looking at sugar, they're missing a lot of the early markers of insulin resistance and progression towards diabetes. Years ago, they used to talk about the waist to hip ratio. And one clever blogger said, you know what, a big butt can basically cancel a big waist. So they talk about the waist to height ratio. So if your waist is more than half of your height, then guess what? You've got a problem. You have a huge probability of diabetes in both men and women. So simple numbers, if you are 6 foot tall, your waist shouldn't be over 36 inches. If you're 5 foot tall, your waist shouldn't be above 30 inches, or your risk of diabetes goes up. This New Scientist edition basically called it the All-American High, and they said, can fast food alter your brain in the same way as tobacco and heroin? And the answer is yes. In fact, these food companies are engineering the food to be addictive. And they're seeing that once people start, they just can't stop. They keep eating and eating and eating. Candace Pert, phenomenal book called Molecules of Emotion. She said, look, sugar is a drug. And in fact, if they tried to get it past the FDA today, they'd have a really hard time doing that. Pretty amazing study here. 94% of rats prefer processed sugar to cocaine. So sugar really is that addictive. And I had a conversation with a patient years ago, and I shared that statistic with her, and she looked at me and she said, wow, no wonder I've always failed. So in those cases, we want to go the extra mile to support brain chemistry to literally start turning around those food addictions. So can exercise help diabetes? Indisputably, absolutely yes. A single bout of exercise can start lowering blood sugar. There are receptors that are within your cells that when you exercise, they come to the surface of the cell and they allow sugar to go into the cell without insulin. And this was a graph where it shows that the units on it is watts, and then how much sugar was taken up. Well, watts are a unit of power. So the more powerfully you contract your muscles, the more sugar you put into the cell. So I'll have my diabetic patients literally contract all the muscles of their body as hard as they can at one time. Do that for 2 or 3 minutes over the course of an hour. And within days, their sugar starts to drop very dramatically. By the way, Alzheimer's is known to be insulin resistance, or even considered a type 3 diabetes of the brain. And type 1 diabetes is associated with viral infections. So you see these young kids, I've known of a handful over this last year, they developed type 1 diabetes after they got a viral infection. Well, the question is, can we prevent that? And the answer is absolutely. With good immune support, we can make that happen. I'll talk about complete nutrition in a bit, but my favorite superfood, Ganoderma lucidum, this was a PubMed study. You can type in this PMID:// 767-6490 if you want to read the study. But they infected the pancreas of mice with Epstein-Barr virus. And if they left them untreated, they all developed type 1 diabetes. But when they gave them Ganoderma with the infection, none of them developed type 1 diabetes. So phenomenal preventive strategy. I talk about autoimmunity and balancing. These are 6 universal strategies to balance the immune system: vitamin D, DHEA, Ganoderma, periliseed, omega-3 resolvins, and repairing the gut. And finally, for type 2 diabetes, Ganoderma works by the exact same mechanism of the type 2 diabetic drug known as metformin. So what's a complete protocol? Well, nature's foods, right? If God made it, it's okay. If man made it, stay away. Eat real food, not too much, not too often, every color, every day, in a way that honors your physiology, your genetics, and your health goals, mostly plants. And when we start talking about diabetes, we want to go with a very low blood sugar diet, and that would be a ketogenic diet. So my memory aid for there is leans, greens, nuts, and seeds. Superfoods, Ganoderma lucidum, many anti-diabetic studies. I showed 2, one for type 1 and one for type 2 diabetes, but there are dozens of studies and it has multiple mechanisms. Functional foods are foods that are supercharged to have a proven health benefit. And there are functional foods in the forms of shakes and even coffee that can help to combat or reverse diabetes. And then to finish my nutrition pyramid, a diabetic is a nutrient wasting machine. And so we add a little multivitamin, multimineral, omega-3 resolvins, probiotics, D3 and K2. And when we do that with the right types of food choices and lifestyle choices, the typical diabetic, type 2 diabetic, is non-diabetic in my office in 60 days or less. So we'll transition to questions and answers. And Carol, before we get to those typed in the chat, one was sent to me earlier today about iron deficiency, which, by the way, this is the most common mineral deficiency on the planet. And I'll share with you why in a moment. But what can happen with iron deficiency? Certainly fatigue and tired because you don't carry as much oxygen to the tissue. For the same reason, you can be short of breath. It's important for brain chemistry, so you can have depression, hair loss, restless legs, etc. But here's the data that I want you to know. Vegetarians or vegans, menstruating or pregnant women, or people that donate blood more frequently are more likely to be iron deficient. And I'm going to emphasize here the menstruating females because we know that the world, literally the world, is estrogen toxic. There's estrogens in plastics, pesticides injected into animals. And so females lose often more blood than they should. And iron takes a bit of effort to absorb, and therefore people can be very prone to deficiency. So in many cases, we want to process out the toxic estrogens. That should normalize the menstrual bleeding, while at the same time starting to build the iron stores. The blood in our body, the red cells replace every 120 days. That's the lifespan of them. So I tell people that they can start feeling better about 1% per day. So with that said, now we can see if there are any questions in the chat.
Yes, there are. And that was a lot of information to absorb tonight. That was incredible. So our first question is from Bianca. Once you get diagnosed with diabetes or on dialysis, can that be reversed by changing your diet and other things?
Well, we want to do both, right? I always tell people we want to do everything we can to reverse the diabetes, and we've done it. Somewhere on my computer, I've got a woman who was a type 1 diabetic who was on a kidney transplant list. She was spilling thousands of units of protein in the urine every single day and needed dialysis multiple times a week and was hoping, on a list for a kidney transplant. But within a year, we had that kidney about 95% better. She was just spilling a trace of protein in her urine. And by the way, over the course of that time, we dramatically improved her blood sugar, which needs to happen in all cases. So is it reversible? If there are cells that are functional but not functioning, that's the answer there. And by the way, the kidney does have regenerative tissue. It just regenerates slow.
Okay. Can type 2 diabetes lead to kidney failure?
Absolutely. It's the most common cause of kidney failure. Yeah, that excess sugar is really bad on the kidneys. And, ultimately the kidneys become damaged. They start spilling protein, they start spilling, sugar and other things in the urine. And it's a big problem. And I don't know how big it is in Canada. I'm thinking it's probably close to here, but there are so many dialysis centers. I have a patient that's a builder. He got a contract to build just dialysis centers. And that was his career. And he became a multi-millionaire building dialysis centers because there's such a demand for them. And the sad reality is it can be prevented. The right strategy, it can be prevented.
Awesome. Karen asks, how long would a person hold the contracted muscles in your body, and how many times per day did you mention doing that?
Well, once you start holding the muscles and contracting them hard, you really only can have maximum contraction for about 6 seconds. That's just chemistry. Once that lactic acid starts kicking in, the contractile strength is going to go down. So what I have people do is they flex and they hold, for 5 or 6 seconds. Then they relax and they shake it out and they flex and they hold again for 5 seconds. And do that, 1 to 2 to, if you're, real ambitious, 3 minutes an hour. And I've got people where literally, I have a 65-year-old woman who was taking 8 different drugs, out of control diabetes. In a day, she was able to get off 2 diabetic meds and get her sugar in control, with all the nutrition. But she said that hourly contraction made a massive difference.
Excellent. Bianca asked, what about people who have had past blood transfusions?
I don't know that I understand the question.
Bianca, is that something to do with the iron we were talking about? Just waiting to see if we have a response to that. Yes.
In a perfect world, we certainly want to avoid blood transfusions. So, the question is, did people have so much bleeding that they needed a blood transfusion? In that case, that's a life-saving intervention. And we want to be able to do that. But, the blood transfusion, in my mind, is a risky and last ditch effort. So, I have a wonderful patient who had a son who had hemophilia and needed regular blood transfusions, and they didn't do a very good screening on the blood, and he developed, AIDS and died from it. And, they've gotten better at checking out blood for the major things like hepatitis and HIV and things like that. But, there's a lot of people that are giving blood, and I hate to say this, there's drug addicts who give blood to get money, or they sell blood, right, to get drug money. Heck, I had, people in chiropractic college that's how they paid their way through school or got their weekend money, was they go and, they'd sell blood essentially. And I would hope that they'd have better screening methods these days. But if you can avoid a transfusion, avoid it. But, the first question we have to ask is what's causing the problem? Whatever's causing the blood loss, the bleeding, there are autoimmune circumstances that can actually cause, destruction of the red cells. And those are pretty risky, and often they do some pretty extreme things, like even just destroy the bone marrow and start with a transplant. That's as extreme as it gets. But, there can be some type of internal bleeding that's missed. If it's heavy menstruation, a good history ought to get that. And then we do the right strategies to control the hormones.
Okay. What generally causes inflammation in the body, and what is best to decrease the inflammation?
I tell people that there are 3 basic mechanisms: trauma, toxicity, or nutrient insufficiency. Those are the big 3. Trauma tends to be obvious. If you got hit by a car, well, you would expect some trauma. Toxicity is probably underappreciated, but we are a progressively toxic world. 80,000+ registered toxic chemicals. Every man, woman, and child walking around has over 700 in their system at all times. That can start that process. And understand that the Global Nutrition Report says that every country on planet Earth suffers from malnutrition. We've depleted the soils, we've intoxicated the soils. So we have a population that is not getting the nutrition they need, getting the toxins that they don't need, and then wondering why they're not feeling so good. And if we're proactive and educated, we can change that.
Excellent. What's the connection with fatty liver and Sibo digestive issues leading to insulin resistance?
Well, that might be the question. You know, the medical literature says this: the first major metabolic abnormality of insulin resistance is fatty liver. So the liver has an interesting job. Actually, it has hundreds of jobs, but it converts excess sugar into triglyceride. And since that's the site where it's happening, it seems that that's the first organ that has excess storage of inappropriate fat, fatty liver. So, you know, would Sibo cause fatty liver and insulin resistance? It could contribute. You know, if Sibo causes an inflammatory process and the body buffers the inflammation with cortisol, cortisol opposes the action of insulin. And therefore, you could make an argument that the cascade could go in that direction, that Sibo happened first, whole body inflammatory process, cortisol, then fatty liver. But more often than not, it would be fatty liver being first. But both of these are far too common. And so, you know, there's good nutrients to get rid of small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Again, Ganoderma is quite good for that. Sometimes we add in some other things that are good at killing things. We also want to get on a very appropriate diet to not fuel the bad organisms, which tends to be ketogenic, often digestive enzymes, and a really good probiotic helps the process as well.
Perfect. Kat would like to know the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, please.
Type 1 is considered almost always an autoimmune attack on the cells of the pancreas that make insulin. It can be triggered certainly by infection. That's a very common cause, viral infection. Certain types of toxins can trigger it. There was a chemotherapeutic agent called streptozotocin that they used to use to treat pancreatic cancer until they realized it killed the beta cells of the liver and they caused type 1 diabetes. Certain food reactions can trigger it. In fact, when people consume dairy, cow dairy has cow hormones and it also has some cow insulin. And cow insulin only differs from human insulin by 3 amino acids. And there's evidence that certain people with certain sensitivities, that's enough to create immune confusion and create an attack on their insulin. But type 1 is autoimmune attack on the cells of the pancreas. Type 2, the person has just not managed their diet, exercise, stress management, life. They have insulin resistance to the point where their pancreas can no longer keep up with the insulin demand. Pancreas becomes fatigued, and then the sugars begin to rise. And that is what they call type 2 diabetes.
Excellent. Xavier asks, what would you recommend for someone who is in kidney failure currently? My friend has a severe condition and mentioned they have holes in their kidneys.
Well, it's extreme, you know, so when they're in kidney failure, they need dialysis so their body doesn't poison itself with the inability to clear waste products. They also, by the way, need extra nutrition because they're losing a lot of the nutrition as well. We have to get that sugar under control really, really fast. And so we go to that full pyramid. We do a ketogenic type diet. We do Ganoderma spores every waking hour. There are medical foods that are specifically designed to enhance insulin signaling from professional nutraceutical companies. A very good plant-based multivitamin, the resolvin form of omega-3, probiotics, and you know, we might take a little bit of a history to find out which probiotic is most efficient, maybe just a really good broad spectrum. And we finished with the combination of vitamin D3, K2, and you know, D is very important for kidney function as well. And if we do enough, long enough, hopefully we start the healing process. And the patient has enough of recovery where, you know, they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And by the way, it's, you know, not their transition to the to the next life, but that, hey, you know what, if I really take good care of myself, I can get out of this. Now, the woman that I described that I have a video on my computer, her name was Cindy, but, you know, she was filling thousands of units of protein. She was in dialysis. They told her she had tons of big holes in her kidneys. And they used to teach that those were not repairable. But we've done it time and again with the right nutrition programs. So they are, but we really have to get after it.
Okay. Sarah asked, what's the connection between too much exercise and insulin resistance? Is it just high cortisol production?
Well, that would be the primary candidate, but remember there are 5 hormones that elevate blood sugar: epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, growth hormone, and glucagon. And so, you might be elevating 4 of the 5 with exercise: epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. And generally we would consider that, to be reasonably okay. But when they over-exercise, when they're over-inflamed, when cortisol runs too high too long, that's more likely going to be the link between too much exercise and insulin resistance. So, Confucius said this, I don't know how many thousands of years ago, but to go beyond may be worse than to fall short. And we find that true with exercise.
Okay. Jeannie asks, is the ketogenic diet the best diet over a long period of time?
Well, there's a lot of people that would argue that it is, but I really like the statement, eat like your ancestors did. So for instance, if your ancestors are from the rainforest, I promise you, you had a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, a lot of greens, and fruits. So, you don't have to be ketogenic to be healthy, but here's some data that we know, and this was 2016 Nobel Prize winning data. When people do intermittent fasting, and, if you have the best genes on the planet, it's still recommended that you do 14 hours a day of no eating, of intermittent fasting. If you have average genes, and by the way, I've had my genes tested. I don't like to admit that I'm average, but I've got average genes in terms of the intermittent fasting. And I need 16 hours a day of no food. And if you have genes that put you vulnerable, and by the way, these are called the ApoE genotypes. If you're an ApoE44, that's called the death genotype. You need 18 hours a day of fasting to preserve your brain and body and heart. So we want to match the diet to the patient's genetics, current health state, and goals. And because we have such an insulin resistant population, ketogenic is going to be great for a lot of people, that's for sure. And as long as you do a healthy keto, I think it was 20 years ago, there was, and maybe it was longer ago than that, there was a Dr. Atkins who wrote Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution. It was the most popular around. And he said keto would be, whipped cream and bacon. That's probably not the best keto diet. So, always eat the most appropriate foods for you.
Excellent. If you want to read the last good news call.
Okay, so great news just before this call from a friend with endocrine cancer. Results 2 weeks later, blood work normal, lots of energy, feeling great now, waiting her CT scan results from yesterday. Coming from a woman that lost her husband on the weekend and diagnosed with endocrine cancer. My screen flipped. Monday morning. This is my why. So fantastic, Claudio. So if you're wanting to know the why does he keep plugging in to learn more so he can share with a knowledge base and make connections with a friend base to help people that may not see the
Is it?
Absolutely fantastic. So congratulations on that, Claudio. Give her a big hug from all of us.
And with that, I believe we've hit the end of the questions for this evening.
All right. Well,
that was a great way to close out, Claudio.
It's a great way to close out. So, I love seeing the smiling faces. There's not many cameras on. There's some pictures, but, thank you all for going the extra mile. Together we can make the world better. So let's just keep working at it. And, next week we'll have another topic. I haven't picked one yet. Maybe anybody have any suggestions?
I'm sure we'll think about it.
All right. Send me a note. All right.
Everybody unmute and say goodbye.
Thank you, Dr. Bob, for all that you do. Love you.
Thank you, Dr. Bob.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Dr. Bob.
Dr. Bob.
Appreciate it.